Let me start. So welcome to you. Some of you might already know we have every month one episode of FSR Insights, which is one of the formats we have in our online event series at Florence School of Regulation. FSR Insights always starts from a piece of research presented by one of our researchers, which in this episode will be Stefano Verde. He's ready to present you his latest work on a quite, at least for me, a new topic, biochar and greenhouse gas removals. Now, he worked together with David. So naturally, David is one of the panelists we have here. David is with Polytechnic University of Torino. He's more the technology expert here, the engineer. He has worked a lot on renewables, biomass, and biochar is his latest passion. So that explains why he is here. Then we also have Sabine with us. Sabine is a researcher at the Mercator Research Institute, and she has a background in international economics, and she has been working on climate change in general, and also specifically on the topic we will cover here today. Then we have Paul. Paul is coming from University College of London. His background is in energy environmental policy. So as you notice here, we will combine economics, policy, and engineering. And I'm sure that will provide a very interesting debate. The debate is cut in two parts with two short introductions by Stefano. The first part is more on the big picture, even just to explain you the topic we're discussing here. And the second part will go into policy. Now, you can engage with us through a poll, which Stefano will introduce, but you can also use the Q&A and the chat box. And I will be the timekeeper here, and I will try to pick up any questions you leave there for us in the chat. Stefano, please guide us to the first poll.
Yes. Well, first the presentation, and then we get to the poll. All right. So can you see my presentation?
Yes. You can still put it on full screen.
Okay. Okay, so thank you, Leonardo, and thank you very much to the panelists for accepting our invitation today. At FSR, our interest in biochar and greenhouse gas removals started about 2 years ago with an analysis of biochar in the EU from an innovation system perspective. That study, pictured on the left, was a deliverable of the Innopaths project, an ongoing Horizon 2020 project led by Paul Ekins. Then last month, David Chiaramonti and myself published a policy brief that focused on implications of biochar and greenhouse gas removals, more generally, for EU policy. And this really is the background paper of my short presentation today. Let's see whether we'll be able to produce an article in the coming months. For now, we know that next June, we'll organize a policy session of the ERI conference on greenhouse gas removals, together with the International Carbon Action Partnership. And Sabine Fuss, also our host today, guest today, will be one of the speakers there. Now, moving to the contents, these stylized graphs should probably be the starting point for any discussion about greenhouse gas removals or negative emissions. For any given increase in the global average temperature, there is a carbon budget that cannot be exceeded. In the left graph, greenhouse gas removals corresponding to the green shaded area are very limited. And this is because emissions are quickly reduced so as to never exceed the given carbon budget. And so removals are needed only to compensate for emissions that cannot be avoided for technical reasons. By contrast, the graph on the right shows that slower emission reductions entail more removals, as these are needed also to compensate for the past overshoot of the carbon budget. Now, a portfolio of negative emissions technologies exists, which can widely differ from one another across multiple dimensions. In these diagrams from Meeus and his co-authors, 7 types of negative emission technologies are considered. So you have afforestation and reforestation, bioenergy capture and storage, biochar, enhanced weathering, direct air capture, ocean fertilization, and soil carbon sequestration. As you can see on the left, relevant dimensions include the level of technology readiness, the possible negative and positive side effects of deployment, the permanence of greenhouse gas removals, and last but not least, the potential in terms of climate mitigation and the abatement cost. The right graph maps these 7 technologies over the last 2 dimensions. Clearly, the ranges of estimates for both global mitigation potentials and for abatement costs can be wide. Biochar is the red rectangle on the bottom left. And as you can see, most estimates of the global abatement potential here range between about 0.5 and 2 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. And consider the current global emissions are around 55 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. While estimates of the abatement costs range from as low as about $20 per ton of CO2 to just over $100 per ton of CO2. I'm sure that David will have something to say here about these figures, the level of technology readiness, and so on. But what is biochar exactly? So biochar itself is a solid carbon-rich material obtained from the heating of biomass in the near absence of oxygen. And that's a process called pyrolysis. The typical intended use of biochar is for improving agricultural soil. That is to say, the typical use of biochar is as a soil amendment. Crucially, when applied to soil, most of the biochar remains there in a stable form for hundreds or even thousands of years. And so that's why the biochar system, which is a more precise term, refers to the production use cycle of biochar, biochar, the material, that results in the long-term removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. Since the 1.5 degree special report of the IPCC about 2 years ago, the biochar system has received full consideration in the portfolio of net emission technologies, of negative emissions technologies by the IPCC. Now, what is special about biochar? Here are some defining features of the biochar system, which concern the multiplicity of biochar co-products, in terms of, and specifically, in addition to biochar, you have bio-oil, process heat, syngas, but also the multiplicity of biochar possible uses and therefore possibility of value chains. So biochar not only can be used as a soil amendment, but also as an additive in animal feed, paints, textile fabrics, insulation material, building material, and even high-tech materials. To give you an idea, there is a paper called the 55 possible uses of biochar. And then, most importantly, multiplicity of benefits that are relevant to sustainable development. So in addition to climate mitigation, we have restoration of soil carbon, which is a major issue, the environmental issue globally, and water conservation, among others. So all in all, the biochar system presents itself as an exceptional negative emission technology in that it can readily provide multiple public goods at relatively low cost, as well as multiple private goods related to the use of biochar as a soil amendment or other possible uses. But now I stop here, and I'm going to propose to the audience a poll, which is the following. To you, do net negative emissions technologies raise more hopes or concerns? So more hopes, more concerns, or one as much as the other?
Thank you, Stefano. And we'll just give everyone a few seconds to think about that. There you go, very fast. So most seem to be hopeful here, but still there is some concerns. And there are a few people that are balanced. So dear panelists, and I think, Stefano, you can stop sharing the slides. Yes. So I can look at the expressions of which of the panelists is most keen to start this discussion. Sabine, I see you really smiling already, so go ahead.
I was trying to vote, but I wasn't allowed. Yes, so I think there was also already a very nice question in the Q&A that sort of points also towards what was implicit in this poll, like where do you see the main hurdles or need for support for the biochar system? Or like actually we do see that we need carbon removal, but actually we have a sluggish policy response. And I think what Stefano's presentation showed, and what I'm actually coming to think more and more, is that biochar could actually be a very good entry point here into CDR, especially opposed to other land-based options that have issues with permanence, with monitoring, measuring. I think biochar offers a couple of advantages where you could have a good entry and then expand towards other land-based CDR approaches. I don't know whether anybody has heard about the European Biochar certification, the EBC standard it's also called. It basically established a very simple CDR accounting and governance, taking advantage of these advantages that biochar offered, permanence, that you can measure it easily. And I think these are the things, the entry points that we have to look for, that we can then continuously improve upon, extend. For instance, the calculation principle that's in the EBC, that could easily be transferred to wood in the construction sector. It's now still voluntary, but producers have large interest. And for instance, Carbon Future, and I think Puro is also thinking about this, really require the application of the standard already. So I think rather to really wait for the big breakthrough and the answer to everything, biochar could be an entry point on the land side to CDR.
Thank you, Sabine. Paul, maybe we go to you.
Thank you very much, Leonardo. And thanks, Stefano, for a nice introduction to the presentation. Well, if I'd been allowed to vote, I would certainly have been a concern person rather than a hope person, because, I mean, it's very interesting that we're now all talking about carbon dioxide removal technologies. And indeed, I've just joined a big consortium in the UK for researching these removal technologies. So you can see I'm not against them in principle. But the fact that we're having to talk about them is not a technical problem, which Stefano said, it's a political problem. The fact is we've wasted 30 years. And the result is that if we want to keep to the targets of the Paris Agreement, we need not only carbon dioxide emission reductions that are beyond all historical precedent, 7% a year, but even then we will overshoot the 1.5 degrees in the second half of this century, and we need huge quantities of carbon dioxide removal. And your diagram there, Stefano, showed 10 billion tons a year of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. 10 billion tons a year, which is simply mind-boggling. And we're putting forward these technologies, which at the moment are absolutely at the beginning of the innovation cycle, in the sense that in terms of the quantities that are there, we understand the scientific principles clearly, but in terms of the quantities that have been deployed, it is an absolutely colossal ask. And anything to do with growing the quantity of biomass that would be necessary to produce anything like the quantity of biochar that is being envisaged is an absolutely enormous social objective. And I do have the worry that our politicians, and indeed our citizens, because our politicians reflect our citizens, desperately looking the whole time for some magic bullet so that they don't have to change their lifestyles and we can go on using fossil fuels in the way that we have been using fossil fuels. And I'm very much afraid that this whole business of carbon dioxide removal is going to be seen as one of those magic bullets. Oh, well, that's fine. We can go on emitting now, and then in the second half of the century, by which time many of us will be dead, someone can come along and grow shed loads of this stuff and make biochar. So I have real concerns about that. Having said that, of the various carbon dioxide removal options that are available, biochar has quite a lot to recommend it. As Sabine said, most of these technologies are really problematic from a measurement point of view. And obviously, if we're going to get markets involved in this, we have to know exactly how much carbon dioxide is being removed from the atmosphere. They have huge problems in terms of duration, because we've seen wildfires all over the planet recently, and those are going to continue. So anyone who tells me that you can offset carbon emissions by growing trees clearly has to persuade me that we're not going to see wildfires in those places that will put the trees straight back into the atmosphere. And biochar is a much more permanent, can be a much more permanent way of sequestering from the air. So you can see that I'm enormously frustrated that we're having this conversation, because we shouldn't have at this stage to be relying on technologies that are still so uncertain and at such an early stage of the deployment cycle. But that's where we've got to because of the political failure to reduce emissions much more sharply over the last 30 years.
Thank you, Paul. David.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was very interesting. I tend to disagree a bit with you, Paul, on some points, but I will try to go through the different aspects. Well, first of all, let me clarify one point. There's no technology development necessary. So we're not talking about anything that is really innovative. We know how to produce it. The technology is absolutely mature. The product is well known, measurable according to several standards, not just one. And we also know a lot about the effects in soil. First point. So the problem is the deployment. If deployment doesn't happen, it's because of policy mostly. And that is the scope of our webinar to my view. Second point, as I was telling to Stefano, I don't like very much that we use for this system the word technology and not the word value chain or route, because that's not about technology, and that's not even only about negative emission. That's about a value chain that can permanently sequester carbon, and that can have a large impact. I will come back to this in a moment. I have higher estimation that also I see in the chat that some attendees are also commenting. I agree with them. The potential is much higher. We come with some number on that. But let me clarify one key point from the carbon point of view, carbon sequestration and carbon removal. Fully agree with you about the huge effort. That's why I think we must be very careful not to kill the good options, because, and I share your concern, policymakers are always looking for silver bullets. We need all the options together to be deployed, if these are good, of course. And I have seen in the past many of these cases with jatropha, jojoba, algae. I could make a list of magic solutions that obviously were not the case, but this does not mean that were good things in these solutions. The way they were used was wrong. Now, let's focus on the carbon sequestration. My personal opinion, in agreement with some papers also that have been published by, for example, Oxford University or others, is we should define the time frame we look for carbon removal to ensure the carbon removal. So my opinion and many others is that 100 years is a reasonable time frame. I think that in 100 years, our energy system will be completely different. So we know that biochar, there are 14 carbon analysis in soil can remain for a very long time, well beyond this time frame. I'm not interested to discuss if it's 500 years, 100 or 1000. The point is the only way that you can sequester for very, very long time, compared to the energy dimension and the emission dimension. So we should start as soon as possible to remove this carbon together with the other option. And the other point, and I think then I can leave you the floor again and we can have other intervention later, is that that's not only about carbon removal. It's about agriculture. It's about sustainability of the primary sector. The publication by the European Environment Agency based on JRC scenario predict that 2050 a reduction in wheat and carbon and corn, production in the Mediterranean European area of 50%. That's a very negative and pessimistic to my view, but even 20 or 30%, it's enormous. So the challenge of removing carbon goes together to the challenge of carbon in soil and sustainable organic, because this is also what we're talking about, is organic agriculture, that we need to push it together. So the two things, to my view, could go hand in hand. It's particularly a problem for the Mediterranean area. We almost have 8.5 million hectares of marginal land under desertification today, increasing, well documented and mapped by GIS. So we can have both actions, remove the carbon, support the soil fertility, and keep more sustainable agriculture running at the same time. Last point, don't forget that with pyrolysis, we also have other products coming out, which are not yet regulated, in which we are carrying out research, which is about the condensate, which is not the oil, is the water phase from pyrolysis. This is usable as a biostimulant, as biofertilizer, at a biocide. There's research to do in this. So you basically come up with three products: the solids, the liquid, the water phase, not the oil, it's not so relevant here, and the energy, all renewables, and multi-policy, addressing many different policies: agriculture, energy, carbon and climate, obviously, and others. So this should go together with the other decarbonization options, as you mentioned. That, but the technology is absolutely mature. So let's try, and that's my final word, let's try not to convey that the technology is still to be developed. Technology is absolutely ready. If it's not deployed, it's because there's no economic case yet. Someone has to pay to remove this carbon, and it will happen then.
Thank you, David. I think on the economic case and the policy is the next part. I think we can still use the remaining minutes in this part to maybe clarify some of the concerns some people might have or not. And also it would be nice if the panelists could say something about the potential. Because we have Hans York in the Q&A saying, you know, could you come back to the relative potential? I think Stefano showed some numbers. So are there maybe other numbers on potential? And I also thought you could maybe react to the question, actually quite detailed question of Linde, who is asking to elaborate a bit more on the sustainability of Biochar. And you know, you already made some reference to certification, but how does that really work? Does that take into account the use of Biochar, even the land use of where that Biochar is put into the land? Yeah, you see there the details of her question. So could you please elaborate on some of these points? And so
maybe because I know the Minx et al. Study quite well, I could say something to the comment of or the question by Hans Jörg. So yes, agreed. The biomass is the limiting factor, and actually, what was shown in the figure in Stefano's presentation is just a snapshot for 2050. The full literature range for 2050 of all the global studies that were considered in the study, so that's pre-2018 literature, ranged from, I think, something between 0.3 to 11.9 gigaton CO2, so considerably more than those two gigaton CO2. And this upper limit assumes that I think 80% of the world's biomass harvest could be converted to use for the production of biochar. And these 2050 snapshots then take into account those biomass constraints. This is also actually why BECS is much lower than the upper range across the whole literature. But also other constraints to scaling, like how quickly, I mean, we're basically with biochar, due to the constraints that also David was mentioning, lacking large-scale applications in the field. And as we're scaling up, we're of course also meeting other challenges than just the biomass supply chain. So maybe that about that. But probably David has a lot more to add because he's the biochar expert.
No, I agree with you. I think it's been, you're right. I also believe the potential recent studies was some 1.1 or 1.2 billion tons CO2 per year sequestration. It was a paper on Nature, but I'm not an expert on that part, so I don't want to claim. I just observe, knowing the farming activity, there's a lot of biomass that is not considered for other uses that we can permanently stabilize through slow pyrolysis. And so we can keep real in the soil where it is desperately needed for a very long time. And this gives me also the opportunity to respond to the question by Valerie. Now, she's asking about the 100 years compared to the carbon neutrality by 2050. targeted by the Commission. These are two different things. The 100-year is what I see as an emerging range of time that researchers consider as a long-lived carbon sequestration. This is the way it is called. So if something is sequestered beyond 100-year, is considered to be long-lived carbon sequestration. And that is easily the case of biochar. Of course, it meets the European Commission carbon neutrality target and soil also targets. The two things can match very well together. While if you use what we call labile carbon that can easily devolatize and come back to the atmosphere, which can be in few years elaborated by the microorganisms in the soil, in that case, this carbon is again converted into various forms, including gaseous forms, and goes back in the atmosphere, which is not the case for the biochar part, that it fixed rather permanently. And another point to conclude is also that you can measure it. I mean, one thing as researchers I really love, the beauty of the biochar, is that I can measure how much fixed carbon I am producing. And if I put it in the soil, I know which exact amount of carbon I am using in the soil. Other methodologies are very, very clever, very interesting on agricultural practices, but there are always models behind, and it's always more difficult to give a quantitative final assessment of the carbon that has been removed. In our case, it's very easy. You can measure it.
Thank you, David. Paul?
Yeah, thanks. I've not got a huge amount to add, but I mean, I would really speak, I think, to Linda's points there about the challenges and uncertainties with biochar. Of course, David's right that we've known pyrolysis technologies for a very long time. I have to say, when it comes to climate change, I'm not remotely interested in just the ability technologically to do something, because to make a difference in the time scale, we need something that can be scaled up quickly. It's similar to the conversation about nuclear fusion. People ask about nuclear fusion. It's irrelevant from a climate perspective, completely irrelevant. It may come on stream in 100 years, it may not, but by that time the climate issue will be decided. So the issue then is how quickly can we scale it up? And I think Linda's points there and elsewhere in the chat about how do farmers actually integrate this into their agriculture? As we know, agriculture is difficult to change. Farmers do what they do. We have annual cropping cycles. Farmers learn quite slowly because they can only learn year by year on the basis of each year. They are quite conservative because they have quite enough volatility to cope with on the basis of their normal lives. So it's a real challenge. And the other point I'd mention, I think, and I worry about these calculations of potential, because actually none of us know what the climate is going to be like in 10 or 20 years' time. The climate is changing very fast, and we're seeing landscape scale events happening around the world on an increasing scale. And the calculation of the quantity of biomass that we can produce on the basis of today's climate could well be out by many, many factors when we actually come to those climates. And then when we consider that land is obviously in scarce supply, we have the food, the need for food, and then we also are looking at forestry for construction to try to make some substitute for cement. I just feel we need to be very, very wary about pushing these technical potentials out to the kinds of levels that they are sometimes pushed out to. And I come back to my original remark, especially if that takes the pressure off emission reduction now, which is where, in my view, the full policy attention still needs to be.
Thank you, Paul. And I think that perfectly leads us also to the second discussion we would like to have, right? on how we would like policy to handle this new opportunity. But as you nicely outlined, it is an opportunity with some potential, but also some issues related to that. But we know that from energy and climate, right? I think if all experts agree on one thing, it's that we never have a silver bullet that can solve everything, right? But we want to keep options open. So Stefano, can you please take us to the second part?
Yes,
on policy questions.
Yes, very happily. So yes, we've got to the policy questions, and here you can see the first bullet point is basically one of the main take-home messages of David's and my study. Basically, that so far the lack of an adequate policy framework has been the main barrier for the diffusion of biochar or nets more generally in Europe, but the same is true for other parts, for the rest of the world, I'd say. And specifically, I think that the lack of financial reward for emission removals, effectively a market failure, is the most obvious missing piece here. Now, as far as, and we think, I mean, certainly for biochar, David and myself think that if it was rewarded, that could propel, if carbon removals were rewarded, that could propel the diffusion of biochar. It would stimulate demand sufficiently to get it started. Now, as far as biochar is concerned, specifically, there have been recently relevant institutional developments in the EU that gives us hope, that show that this policy framework is starting to take shape. So, for instance, there's a recent new fertilizing products regulation, where biochar makes its first appearance in EU legislation. Then the announcement by the European Commission of an EU certification system for all carbon removals to be presented ready by 2023. These are clearly requirements for the biochar system to work. Then, as of 2030, the fact that net emissions of the LULUCF sector, LULUCF stands for land use change and forestry, are going to count, at least in part, toward the achievement of the emissions target. Then in the reform of the common agricultural policy that is now under negotiation, a big emphasis is on the support for carbon farming. And these are just some of the most important examples that this framework is taking shape, but, and we get to the next slide, important fundamental questions, policy questions remain. Now, the first one that you see there is really a general question about removals, and basically the concern that we already started discussing now, that both current and expected future emission removals can deter emission reductions, and that this fact increases the risk of getting locked into a high temperature pathway, so a form of carbon lock-in. So the question to the panelists is indeed a major issue to you. Paul already expressed his opinion on that. And then going more specifically on the EU policy framework, you see here a question that will be a poll actually for the audience. And it starts from the observation that the EU's commitment to reaching net zero emissions by 2050 does not distinguish between emission reductions and emission removals. Now, should the EU set specific targets for emission reductions and emission removals? Now, Chiara, we're not, I think we asked this in a minute. All right, so should we have separate targets, as Sweden did? Sweden is the only case of where these two the climate neutrality target has been decomposed into two components, and should it be done as soon as possible? Okay, we'll get back to this with the audience, and three questions for the open questions for the panelists. Now, which policy instruments should be used to reward emission removals? Possibilities are that we can think of are subsidies, whether for the biochar under the common agricultural policy or not, or subsidies more in general, a mandatory market for removals, something on the lines of tradable green certificates for supporting renewable energy, for instance, Or the UETS could be used in the way of, if removals are allowed as offsets that regulated companies can use for compliance, or something else. And then the following question is related to the previous, of course. Who should be liable for emission removals? Should it be taxpayers, as with subsidies, or fossil fuel companies, or someone else? And finally, well, what role for voluntary carbon markets, of which we hear a lot recently? And yeah, there's a lot going on. There's, I think Mark Carney is very active on stepping up the voluntary carbon markets, and biochar is certainly one of the options there. So, as announced, I move to the poll for the audience. Should the EU set specific targets for emission reductions and emission removals? And should it be done as soon as possible? So, yes, and urgently, yes, but not urgent, or no, there's no need of distinguishing between the two targets.
Again, the panelists cannot vote, but they have the right to speak. So now is the time for the audience to speak through voting. Aha. Yes, and urgent is the majority, but again, audience is still spread, and I'm also very curious to know what our panelists will say about this one. So we can again stop sharing the slides, and so we have a better view of the panel. There we go. Who wants to go first on this one? I see you thinking. Paul, maybe I go first to you then.
Yeah, I'm used to being put on the spot. That's all right. And I guess I'd like to take, first of all, a language issue here. To me, paying for carbon removal through biochar would not be a subsidy. It is payment for an ecosystem service. And unless we get our economic system sorted out, so that we start paying for ecosystem services, and it is recognized as being absolutely the way we organize our economy, then frankly, we're not going to make a lot of progress, particularly on the other big crisis that we face, which is the crisis of nature, which obviously depends on ecosystem services for any kind of recognition of value. And we dive there into the kind of the Dasgupta review that was published recently, etc. So, of course, we should pay for activities that remove carbon from the atmosphere. But that then leads to the other side of things. Well, who pays for it? And again, the economic answer to that is absolutely straightforward. We need a carbon tax. Because if we're not going to pay, if we're going to pay for ecosystem services of removing carbon, why on earth do we not charge people for emitting carbon? And I mean, I mean, you said yourself there was a market failure in the payment side, but Nick Stern called climate change the greatest market failure the world has ever seen because of our failure to charge for carbon emissions. And were we to charge for carbon emissions, then there would clearly be a source of revenue where we could start paying for ecosystem services on an absolutely regular kind of basis. And to me, that's the single most important overhaul that we need to make in our economic system, if our economic system is to come anywhere near approaching sustainability. Obviously, with greenhouse gas removal generally, there are huge measurement issues, and I'm very encouraged that both David and Sabine, I mean, I haven't looked into this directly myself, but I'm very encouraged that both of them seem to think that with biochar there's a degree of surety about the quantity of carbon that you're removing. And I can imagine that under those circumstances, it would be possible to set up a carbon market in that way. One final remark on the issue of voluntary carbon markets. You'll have seen I'm a concerned citizen generally. I'm extremely suspicious of voluntary carbon markets. I'm extremely suspicious of the entire offsetting game that we are finding ourselves engaged in at the moment, because I think the degree of monitoring, reporting and verification around this, and the likelihood that a lot of this stuff that is called offsetting is actually going to still be sequestered carbon in the long term is very, very small indeed. And I'm noticing all sorts of the uses of language whereby the fossil fuel industry says it's going to offset, it's going to justify future exploration in oil and gas production because somehow it's going to offset these extra carbon emissions that come out through some means yet to be determined. This strikes me as an absolute scam. And our policymakers really need to get on top of that. And it's precisely another example of the kind of waterbed effect of the way in which we all are looking for ways out of actually having to change anything fundamental in our society to cope with the climate crisis.
Thank you, Paul. Sabine?
Yeah, so Paul has already covered quite a bit. Let me also try to answer the question. So let me start with the moral hazard issue. I think, first of all, I think we're not where we are because we always had in mind that we will be able to remove CO2 from the atmosphere at large scale, and focusing now on the potential of carbon removal as the force that steers us off a 1.5 degree pathway will probably lead us to overlook or at least underestimate that there are also other important factors in the game. Having said that, I also think that depending on how regulation will look like or not actually, it is actually our duty as scientists to point to the risk of moral hazard and also to ways how to contain it. And I think starting with the separation of targets, as discussed in a policy brief and pointed to by Stefano, could be such a way. And some countries are thinking that way. I think in the UK, it's also been discussed. Sweden was mentioned. I think in a nutshell, however, looking at one of the 1.5 degree pathways makes immediately clear that carbon removal is something that has to come on top of deep and rapid emissions reductions, and making that transparent again and again, even if we feel like parrots, will continue to be key. And that's also picking up on some of the questions and discussion that's been going on in the chat in the meantime. Then turning to policy instruments, some considerations. I think in principle, from an economic point of view, emissions and withdrawals should be priced equally. And this also applies to the dynamic consideration of a CO2 price path, whereby with net negative emissions, balancing a public financing requirement arises, which cannot be covered any longer by an income from CO2 pricing, of course. However, there might be market failures, externalities, technology-specific distortions. And so there might be maybe cases where it's indicated that we should differentiate prices. And I think there's basically two ways to go in a governance architecture for CDR. One is the use of individual measures to promote individual CDR technologies or activities. And Stefano mentioned a few entry points for biochar there. And the other one is a price-based approach in which a carbon price, like Paul also argued, or a CDR reference price represents the central instrument. And that can still be supplemented by additional regulation or subsidies to take specific technological, ecological, or economic aspects into account, right? If you have concerns about sustainability of biomass supply, for instance. And that price-based approach would, of course, also include what Stefano was pointing to, whether we want this in the EU ETS, for instance. So these are just some general considerations how policy could go about. But that leaves open the liability question. I think in the case where we have CDR fully integrated in the EU ETS, it's easy. Every ton of CO2 that's still emitted, if we're carbon neutral, needs to sort of pay for its own removal. So the liability is clearly with the respective emitters. However, and I briefly mentioned it before, if we want net negative emissions, then we have to find another revenue source. Similarly, society might decide that there are certain emissions that cannot be further reduced. For example, a certain amount of meat that's preferred over a purely vegetarian diet. And that leaves hard to abate non-CO2 GHGs that have to be compensated for by removal. And in this example, I think there is a case for society to pay part of the cost for its preferences and use tax money to remove residual emissions associated with this. Surely these are all oversimplifications, but they are not meant to represent a comprehensive solution, but just to give us something to discuss with, and to be able to ask us the right questions that we will have to address. And that leaves the voluntary carbon markets, exactly. Where in our work, and we did a lot of reviewing work also, we identified a large innovation gap when it comes to CDR. Even if technologies are proven, the innovation chain is much longer than that. And to accelerate innovation, you could have grants and funding for R&D projects, CO2 price signals, Paul mentioned that, and so on. But these are still considerations. And I think in the meantime, with the caveats that Paul already explored sufficiently about, I think voluntary carbon markets could play a role while we transit to compliance markets. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Maybe now I can look at Stefano and David together, right? Because your policy brief did not really want to already give an answer to these questions, right? But I guess you already had some ideas yourself. Did they change now that you listened to Sabine and Paul expressing their views on the alternative instruments?
I don't know. How do I start? I agree on many of the things that have been said. Just a few remarks, because even in the working, we say negative, which is not perceived as a positive matter, technology, which is not dealing with the value chain we are discussing. So I think that among us as experts, it's fine. But when we address policymakers and the general public, we should change our way of communicating. It's just a matter of wording, not the content. I wish to recap a couple of points. One by Paul about the farmers is absolutely right. We work with farmers in 30 years. They're very, very conservative. But for that reason, I can reasonably say that the only societal group in the Mediterranean area, at least, that really experience the climate change are the farmers. Farmers already face the climate change effects every year. There are years there is no rain for 4 months, years they cannot even harvest their products because of too wet conditions or flooding. So really, this group is more aware than what we think about the climate change. They have already developed some innovative models, maybe you know, like the biogas dendrite, etc. But these models only spread it out, developed because the policy was analyzing and supporting the farmers' effort. So I think that they are ready to follow in presence of a good policy, and this makes a difference depending on the agroclimatic region where you are. When I speak to my friends from Finland or Denmark, obviously I feel that the perception of the agricultural issue is very different there, and it's understandable, of course. Another key point that has been raised by Stefano, I think we should avoid, because I fully recognize the concern from Paul, that offsetting can be a nice way to escape through the, but we should do our best effort not to put these two in competition. The fact that a certain chain can help to bring the carbon where it is needed, the good carbon in the right place, does not mean that this allows you to emit. And that's probably the challenge. We should be able to propose something that brings together the two. Do not discourage the good practices, but also do not allow these good practices to skip the problem of emitting. In this moment, we do have a lot of projects on biofuels. We have with all oil majors, and we are working a lot now in the European project on the low ILUC concept. This can be a nice way to bring them to support the most difficult areas in return of sustainable production of energy, but also food and feed, because in that moment we are producing camelina oil and barley for food and feed in the same lab in rotation. So actually, again, if you open your view, I mean, you can really bring all together. But I recognize the difficulty to do this. Equal pricing. Let me give you one point. Today, 1 ton of CO2, depending on regulation, ranges from 20 euro ton to 500 or more euro per ton. That's completely crazy. I mean, you cannot accept that the same thing has one order of magnitude different value. If I produce a biofuel, for example, a biojet, 1 ton of carbon will cost some, let's say, 1,500 euro. If I produce compost, which is not fixed carbon, it will cost 0. If I produce biochar, it could be from 2 to 400 ton per carbon ton, the same ton of the biojet. So that is something we should seriously rise and address. It's impossible that the farmer providing an ecosystem service, removing carbon, does not see the same recognition that the biofuel producer, which is my field of work, I know well, is observing for his product. So and that's a really challenging political matter, to bring many different sectors into a fair discussion to try to balance and favor the most effective solutions in a complementary way. So this issue is very critical. Last point, Peter was asking about proving to third plan. Well, in this moment, we are working with one of the certification body to develop an additional package for low ILUC feedstock. I'm sure there are already existing certification systems that need further development, but are already in preparation, Puro, Verra, that can quite well be used to provide a third-party certification, which anyway is the base for any emission reduction in the fuel sector approach. They all go around these things. So my feeling at the moment is very right to start a serious grouping of carbon removal and more sustainable use of the land, recovery of biodiversity, land, and so on.
Thank you, David. Stefano?
Yes, I would like to just to offer 3 comments in response to the previous ones. Well, first, Paul said that rightly so, to talk more to use the term payment for ecosystem services rather than subsidies, and that to finance those payments we should use a carbon tax. So I guess this is another option for revenue recycling of a carbon tax. Now the issue is that we have many it's an additional possible uses of the revenues raised by a carbon tax. Then in response to Sabine, she made a comment about the possibility of using the ETS to promote removals, and the question of price differential, difference in carbon prices. And I think that there should be a difference in the carbon price that polluters pay and the carbon price that those who do the removals receive, and that this difference should reflect the risk, the difference in risk between reducing emissions, and there's risk 0, and removing emissions, which has some risk, maybe in aggregate rather than in the specific case. And so here we're not talking about the permanence of the sequestration. We could have biochar that is perfect at sequestering carbon, but I think that in pricing that, in the rewarding, you should take into account the systemic possible negative effects, and so this should be reflected in the pricing. And then finally, concerning the voluntary carbon markets, I share the concerns that here our expert panelists have, and I think that the issue of removals is too important to be left to the voluntary markets, and it should be carefully regulated. And I agree with Sabine that it's to regard that voluntary markets as on the way to making them mandatory.
Thank you. Sabine, please.
Yes, I agree with Stefano. I wanted to briefly react to the price premium for removals. There can for sure be market failures, externalities, risks, what have you, that would call for price differentiation. But in that case, maybe it's actually then good to go for a separate target and have separate regulation, because I fear if you have price differentiation within a trading scheme, you creating all sorts of incentives that you don't want. I mean, it would then be more profitable to remove something than to emit, and you could get rich with an inefficient BECCS plant, for instance. So just as an example.
Thank you, Sabine. We go to Paul.
Yeah, just a few reflections on the very interesting things that other panelists have said. I mean, to be a bit more positive about biochar, I think the points that David makes about the co-benefits are potentially very, very important and perhaps need greater emphasis. I've been very interested how the whole co-benefits issue with regard to local air pollution is now playing quite positively in the climate mitigation discussion, and I think this is therefore very relevant to that. I think that it's the issue of equal carbon pricing. I mean, obviously, as someone who was trained as an economist, I think equal carbon pricing per se is a good thing for all the reasons that we understand. But equally, this is such a complex system that it remains to be something that I think we will struggle to get. And I think there are 2 or 3 reasons why we shouldn't aim for equal carbon prices. And certainly, I mean, the biofuels issue, my perception on biofuels is that it's an absolutely classic case of policy too quickly without properly being thought through. And it's been largely been a disaster. And that I would be very, very sad if a promising approach like biochar was to founder on the same kind of inappropriate policy. And it seems to me that when you take account of the potential positive co-benefits, and something that perhaps David can elaborate on a bit more, potentially the prospects for innovation and therefore cost reduction in the pyrolysis process. I had a good friend you probably know in earlier projects in the UK who'd been working on pyrolysis for many, many years. And it seemed to me from talking to him that it was a bit of a stuck technology. And I'm just wondering whether actually we can get the kind of real game-changing innovations that we've seen, for example, in the offshore wind market, where the cost of offshore wind has come down by 75% over the last 10 or 15 years in the UK North Sea context anyway. You know, whether actually biochar possesses those kinds of innovations. And finally, just a thought, and Sabine knows much more about this than I do, because I know she's published lots about it, but it seems to me that if I was wanting to set up a market with biochar, I think that to do it through the ETS might be quite a good way of doing it, but precisely because you would then be separating, you'd have a regulatory barrier between the requirement to pay for emissions, which is what industry has, at least when they don't get them given for free. And we hope that that's going to be sorted out through some border carbon adjustment in the not too distant future. You've got some sort of regulatory barrier between the requirement to pay for emissions, and then the Commission would be responsible for commissioning biochar and having some money whereby it could pay farmers through the CAP if necessary for biochar removals. And I'm even toying with the idea of something like a contract for difference for biochar, actually going out and saying, okay, here's a feed-in tariff for biochar. We will pay, this year we pay £300 a tonne, if that's your price, David. Next year we pay £250 a tonne, if that's, you know, because we hope to get some innovation, so that we really start getting the farmers thinking about this, because it's quite possible, in my view, that once we started deploying this thing at scale, it may be that all sorts of things became possible with all sorts of agricultural wastes and residues that are not currently being used, that farmers would find a way of converting that to biochar at much lower cost than is currently the case. Anyway, just a few ideas.
Thank you, Paul. You have the last minute, David. Are you ready to take up this innovation challenge of Paul?
I don't know if Paul, you were referring to Tony Bridgewater or Patricia Thornley or these guys from Aston and Birmingham. But yes, I mean, technology, most of the effort on pyrolysis, including myself, I started early 90s on that, was on fast pyrolysis to produce oil. only one professor from Hawaii University, very good ones, was addressing the production of solids. Now this has come back to the attention today because of the lack of carbon. I fully follow your reasoning on ETS. I'm not an expert. I do not pretend to be an expert on the measure to use that. I only make a small remark. We are on the verge of a dramatic change we are asking to the agriculture and to the industrial sector. Really, really huge. To allow such large investments, we need to provide stable and certain financial environments, because otherwise it's very difficult to leverage the necessary financing for the investments, even if distributed once, I mean, not necessarily big installation, but repeated many times. In fact, I think you have seen a couple of weeks ago, the American Petroleum Institute calling for a carbon tax. It was quite surprising. Of course, there were two parties, one saying, yeah, they do this because they want to continue to emit, and the other said other reason. But and this is my conclusion, I was just observing that a financial system that is based on a fluctuation of the value makes very problematic to allow a large-scale deployment of financial resources, large-scale investment, because there are too many uncertainties and risk for the industry side, and also for the farmers becomes a bit problematic. We should find a compromise within ETS to give a reasonable, at least for a reasonable time, a good pricing that can leverage the investment, and maybe the European Investment Bank, that should become a green bank, could help on this. Last point. There's no ILUC here. It's negative ILUC. We are recovering land. So there's no ILUC issue. Here we are on the reverse side. Land is recovered, not lost, not shipped.
Thank you, David. Let me conclude by thanking all of you. And we had a particularly active Q&A box, people even creatively using the Q&A box to connect with each other, which is very welcome, right? We like to be a platform where new experts meet and also continue the conversation after this event. Talking about continuing the conversation, maybe, Stefano, we just use the last seconds to show the next events, because we are in a series of online events here. So if anyone is interested to join the next upcoming events, we have, as you can see there, oh, yes, we have 3, right? So if you want to register for one of these other 3, as you can see, we have one where we're going to present a whole book that we collaborated on with the Danish regulator. And then we have on energy efficiency. And for, closer to the topic of today, 7 April, our colleagues will organize something on the EU ETS and the very specific topic of the market stability reserve. So I'm sure we will see some of you back there. And that was it. Thank you. Really great. Very dynamic panel. Great presentation by Stefano. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the invitation.